Hello, everybody at home. Sorry, the music started again. Oh, wait. Sorry. Hello, everybody at home. I'm Nicole, the manager of Read It Again bookstore in Georgia, and I'm joined today by author Andrew Eliopulos to discuss his new book, The Fascinators, which was our July pick for our Not So Young Adult book club. Andrew, for those watching who haven't read it, could you describe The Fascinators to them?
Sure. And thanks so much for having me, Nicole. I was so sorry I couldn't be there in person. I've loved corresponding with you and looking up your bookstore in Sewanee. I'm from Noonan, Georgia, originally, and have lived in New York for the past 12 years, but get back to Georgia a couple times a year to visit my family, who all still lives in the Noonan area. So I hope to actually get to visit your store in person. But in the meantime, this virtual conversation, The Fascinators is my first young adult novel. It's about a boy named Sam who's about to start his senior year at a Georgia high school that's not too unlike the one where I went, except that in Sam's world, in the world of this novel, magic exists. And Sam and his two best friends, Delia and James, practice it as an extracurricular at their school. It's kind of the thing that they have in common. They're on the magic club. But with senior year just about to start, Sam is realizing that he might actually have a crush on James. They've been best friends for a while. They're supposed to be roommates at UGA next year. So the fact that Sam is realizing that he might want to be more than friends is problematic for their friendship, to say the least. And then when senior year starts, James reveals that over the summer he got mixed up with a group of magickers that kind of feel like a cult. And now, because he accidentally stole something from that group, the group has a target on them, and they're basically chasing Sam and his friends. So big external conflicts, inner emotional drama at the same time, balanced together as The Fascinators.
That's great. Yeah, we really enjoyed it for book club. Let me give you the background for people who don't know you. Andrew Eliopulos is a children's book writer and editor living in Brooklyn, New York. He may or may not believe in magic. Originally from Georgia, Andrew graduated from the University of Chicago, where he double majored in Germanic studies and fundamentals issues and texts. Andrew's debut novel, The Spider Ring, was an International Literacy Association Children's Choices Reading List pick and a Grand Canyon Reader Award nominee. His first novel for teens, The Fascinators, is out from HarperCollins, came out in May 2020. You can find Andrew on Twitter and Tumblr at Andrew, as always, or on Instagram at Andrew_Eliopulos. So your other book, The Spider Ring, was written for a younger audience than this one. Could you talk about the challenges in writing for different ages?
Sure. So The Spider Ring was what we, in publishing call middle grade, which means it's for ages 8 to 12. And so the, conflicts facing kids of that age are a little bit different. Whereas in The Fascinator, Sam's gearing up for senior year, he's looking ahead to college. And so, the conflicts are that sort of awakening to like having a crush on a friend, and thinking to life after high school and what it's going to look like when you're out on your own. When you're writing a middle grade book for those younger kids, you're very much thinking about your place in your family. The Spider Ring was another story that mixed friendship themes and magic in the real world. It was about a girl whose grandmother dies and leaves her with this ring that has magical properties. But instead of like the ability to, talk to birds or squirrels or things that the cute Disney princesses get to do with their magic, the main character of that book realized she had the power to, talk to and even sort of control spiders. And that, she already felt like a weird girl. That's something that I do in all of my work. I write about the outcasts, the people who feel like they don't fit in their schools. That character felt like the fact that she had this power over spiders affirmed everything she thought about her being an outcast. And so in some ways they were exploring similar themes, and other ways, again, because it was for that younger audience, it doesn't quite go as dark. There is certainly not, the brush with a cult and the breaking of the friendship that you have in The Fascinators. But in other ways, it was, a story of a girl like realizing she might need to be a better friend to her best friend, who she's kind of been taking for granted in some moments, and grappling with these feelings of feeling a little bit weird even within her own family when her grandmother dies. It was funny to realize, without meaning to, how many things ended up in both stories, even though they ended up very different because they were for different ages.
What do you think it is that draws you to the like contemporary setting, but then plus magic?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I grew up. I read Goosebumps as a young kid, and then I went, to reading Redwall. My
I love
local
Redwall.
independent. I love Redwall. My local independent bookstore was called Scott's Books. It's no longer open, but it was in Noonan, and they had, in the children's corner, they just had so many Redwall books, and the fact that there were so many of them is like part of what drew me to them, because I knew that when I loved one of them, there were 12 more waiting for me. And so I was reading all of these fantasy books. I went from there to Lord of the Rings. I read Edgar Allan Poe, who sometimes had like the occult and the otherworldly in his stories. But on the other hand, I was also always drawn to contemporary realism too. And I think in the Southern tradition, like some of the books that we were reading in school and in class, like were so much about Southern life and the life around you. I always was sort of imagining like, what would this kind of magic and these fantasies, these epic fantasy stories I'm reading look like in our world? And so, when I was first starting to write the Fascinators, I will say that even though it was always set in Georgia, it wasn't always set at a public school that looked like mine at Noonan, because I thought I wanted it to be like this private school where you could major in magic, almost like a Hogwarts, but almost like, I was thinking of, I went to the Georgia Governor's Honors Program when I was living in Georgia, and I loved how that summer program, like, students had a major. So there was a while where I was trying to make it this like magic school setting and make it further from the setting that I knew growing up. And I realized it just wasn't quite fitting. It for a number of reasons, things weren't quite gelling with the plot. And finally, the thing that unlocked it was, like, I realized there was a story that I really wanted to tell about the real place. I moved it geographically a little bit east, and I certainly changed a number of details, but a lot of the feelings and some of the real places were inspired, just kind of adjacent to things from Noonan. And I think it's, that desire to like tell something about, my own upbringing, but then combine it with the magic that I've always loved reading. That's just always the way my mind has worked.
Yeah, I think that the way that you didn't have it set at a magic school where you can major in magic made it seem like really unique, because we've seen that, but here where it was like a little magic club and more like a speech and debate kind of a setting than like something that was like super respected in that area, it made it something new.
Thank you.
Yeah, it was great. I really enjoyed that aspect of it. Could you talk? We were wondering in the book club about whether the fact that it was so like disrespected or like seen as like the work of the devil a little bit, if that was specific to Georgia, and if you did you have larger world building in mind with like how magic was received in other areas in like the North or in the West?
Yeah, absolutely. It is this thing where, I remember in my town in Georgia, in Noonan, this is one of the things that it wasn't originally part of the story at all, but that when I really went back and tried to make it look more like what I remembered growing up, my grandfather was a Southern Baptist interim pastor. He had been an editor of the Southern Baptist Today. And I grew up, going to a Baptist church in a town, small town square where there were possibly 5 churches within a line of sight of mine. Like it was very much, religion. And the question at school was always, what church did you go to? And, I remember when, when Harry Potter was first coming out and it was big in the news, and, this idea that there was some deep suspicion of it. There was like, this is promoting witchcraft. And those sort of feelings and those sort of, that difficulty, since I was such a magic fan and was feeling like, oh, I already feel a little bit of an outcast here, ended up dovetailing. And I remember like looking to Atlanta, which, even though it was only about 30 minutes away, felt this like distant, inaccessible place. And then really looking forward to, big cities like Chicago and New York, and thinking like, that's where, I had friends growing up. I liked them, but I just always in my head thought, okay, my real life is going to start when I get out of this town frankly. I was that kid who was growing up like, you know, everything that I'm doing is kind of preparing me. I was like the A+ kid, working really hard so that I could try to get accepted into a school far away. As you said, I went to the University of Chicago. Like, I just had a tunnel vision looking ahead to getting out of Georgia. And, you know, in retrospect, like, there were so many things I had so many, I missed out on so many things as a result. And I feel like, you know, I'm so thankful that things like Facebook and social media exist and have kept me connected to the friends that I had in Georgia, because they were, you know, in retrospect, you get to a point in your life and you realize, like, oh, wow, those were really great friends. And I'm, you know, like, I should be luckiest to find people like that anywhere in the country. But when I was there, like, again, it was very much defined by, this is what it looks like here. I have these big, you know, grandiose dreams of what it looks like in a big city somewhere else. And so that's kind of what I wanted to capture in the world building of the book, was that, you know, I do, to your question, like, I do have a sense world building wise of what it looks like to practice, you know, magic and in the bigger cities, like in New York where I live. But the story and you know, keeping the focus narrow on what it looks like when it is something that's being othered, and sort of, you know, a little bit like overlooked, because everyone in this world obviously can do magic to some degree, but in a community like this one, most people don't choose to like practice it or improve it. Keeping that focus narrow on what it looks like in a community like that was a big part of the story that I wanted to tell, which is why in this book you don't end up, you know, they take a trip into Atlanta, they see what it looks like at this like art gallery house where some, you know, people, we meet somebody who's one of the keepers working in a think tank. So you get these like small glimpses of what it might look like in DC or in the rest of the world. But it's all pinned on, like, a lot of it is pinned on Delia's hopes for going to Pinnacle, like going to this college where it really, you know, would really happen if she could get there.
Right. And so you mentioned like being the straight A student who's trying to get out, and that seems to tie in closer to Delia's arc than Sam's. Which character do you think you relate the most to?
Yeah, it's you know, when you when you become a writer, like, you realize that even when you don't mean to, your books often have this like dreamlike quality in the sense that you're a little bit of everyone, you know. Even when you try really hard to write someone who is not you at all, you realize like that to get your way into that character is sometimes to like tap into the ways that you are alike, or things that you have in common. And absolutely, Delia is like, you know, she's more ambitious, she has more drive than I did. But I do, you know, I've had the thought before of like, yeah, Delia is what I might have looked like if, turns out, I got, you know, I did not get into any of the schools that I had that tunnel vision on, and felt like, oh my gosh, you know, what's my alternative? What's my way out? But I think, you know, I think Sam, like, is in being that person who, you know, really just wants to be a good friend, and, you know, doesn't always get it right, doesn't always, like, you know, he's not always the best at knowing what's going on with Delia. He's sometimes like, so he's got that tunnel vision on his relationship with James and sort of misses some things. There's a little bit of, you know, there's a little bit of me in that character too. You know, and even some of the things that James is going on. I mean, I know James is sort of like the archetypal, like bad boy character, love interest in some ways, but like some of the things that he's dealing with, I felt like I wrote into him, you know, from a personal place. So most like maybe Delia would be short answer, but a little bit of everybody. Yeah.
Okay. And Susan had a question in the comments. She says, sequel with that bigger focus. Do you have any plans for a sequel?
There is not a sequel currently in the works. I mean, I will say, like, I have a sense of what the sequel would be if it gets to that point. I've been working on something unrelated in the meantime, but I do have a sense of what a sequel would look like. And the thing is, it would go into that bigger focus a little bit. It would go into the origins of magic, like where, you know. And Denver has more of a connection to it, in fact, than maybe Sam. So it might even look like more of a Denver story than a Sam story. But in the meantime, for a pre-order campaign that I did for the book, I wrote a prequel story that took place a year before, and was just kind of like a moment when, you know, Delia, Sam, and James were going to a concert for their favorite band to try to like it was supposed to be a celebration moment after Magic Conference that year, but then Delia was like forced to work the same night. So, you know, she does a spell that like is kind of like astral projection. She's supposed to be in two places at once and everything goes awry. But the point is I had so much fun getting back into the world to write this prequel short story that, you know, it was that feeling like, oh, maybe there is way more to tell in this world than I, you know, when I did finish the book, I thought, I'm so, you know, this is the story I wanted to tell in this world, but it was fun getting back into it.
Yeah, well, you've built up like that larger world, so there's more room to play. Yeah, so Robin asks, as an adult, how do you stay current with what appeals to young adults?
It's a good question. Also, so by day, I'm a middle grade and young adult book editor, and you know, with my middle grade book, with the Spider Ring, I did some school visits where you go into schools and talk to those 8 to 12-year-old kids, and it was always so interesting which elements of the story they like keyed in on and asked questions about. And working with authors who do middle grade and young adult books, like that seems to be a recurring theme that I hear from people is, you know, you write the book in one place, and then often when you start hearing from the readers who are the age of the characters, they're picking up on things, you know, elements that you didn't even expect. Other than that, like the other joke about children's book writers is that everybody feels like they've got that age that they are inside, like that age where they froze kind of as a kid a little bit, or like had something happen that they're just like trying to work through again and again and again. And since I did do a book for younger kids and a teen book as well, like I can't say, oh yeah, one felt more like me, but I definitely tapped into these feelings and moments. Like, you know, there's a dance in the Fascinators at the convention that I felt like was so many school dances at once. I was like, you know, so in some ways I'm writing from that place of memory. And then to stay current, like, you know, it is a lot of reading, keeping up with like the other like shows and books that are being published for teens and children. Like I've been watching The Babysitter's Club on Netflix right now. And like, in some ways, you know, the stories as they were published when they were first published haven't changed. In other ways, you see the way they update them with technology, you know, and even like make some good jokes about like having a retro phone and stuff like that. But I think it's that kind of like staying current with, you know, what apps are people actually using to communicate. I had to, you know, add app-based communication in the Fascinators, which was not at all true of when I was in high school. But yeah, those details like that to make sure it stays current. And I personally, I will also say to this question, this is a big debate I have with authors I work with as an editor as well. It's like, how many topical references can you get away with? Like, you know, Sam does have a Lady Gaga poster in his room because I felt like she was somebody who, you know, I hoped is proven true. Like people would still be listening to her when the book came out, you know, a year after I finished the draft. But there are other references that I like, you know, I made up a TV show, partly because I wanted there to be like a TV show that had magic in it, but partly because I was like, oh, I better not reference a TV show that's out right now that is immediately dated. So.
Yeah, you mentioned the social media in it, and I was curious about if the like Friendavist and the V-Clips, if that was trying not to date yourself with social media, or if it was like that magic had influenced like the naming of them and the creation of the apps and what they did in this like slightly alternate universe.
Yeah, it was a little bit of both. You know, and in fact, I will say like one of the biggest ways that the Fascinators changed after it was acquired by an editor for publication, because there were a couple editors who were interested in it, and you know, I had these conversations with them, and I could tell all of them had questions and notes about the same areas. But in the original draft of the Fascinators, technology was a much bigger part, and Sam actually was a vlogger. Like my vision for him was that he was like his way of thinking beyond Friedman, Georgia, the fictional town, is that, you know, he was connecting with people on social media, and he would like go on Facebook and he would do like these minor illusion spells, almost like you know, Troy Sivan would go on and sing a song or something. And you know, because the story really wanted to be this insular thing and defined by the way that magic looked in a community like this as apart from a big city, the fact that he was so plugged in online and so connected, it was just one of those things that never quite fit. But having like a V clip, having my own platform that worked in the exact way that I wanted, instead of having to say, okay, he posts an Instagram story and then he cross posted on Facebook or whatever, you know, like they kind of were holdovers from when social media was an even bigger part of the story, and I wanted it to work in a very specific way. And just, yeah, they held.
Yeah, that makes sense. You mentioned that you're working on something new that's unrelated. Is that one going to be for middle grade or young adult, or what are you able to tell us about it?
I can tell you it's young adult. I can tell you it is fantasy in a totally different world. But that's where I would limit it, because I would also say, like, it's one of these things where I had been working on it before the pandemic hit, and then the pandemic hit, and suddenly some of the themes resonated in a different way, and maybe even felt too real when it was supposed to be a escape for me as well as for readers. So I'm having to rethink some of the elements of it, but have, you know, like, part of my process is starting with journals and notebooks and really just writing the pages of world building and some character notes and details. So that's a project where, you know, I've written in actual pages, you know, this much, in world building and story development. I have a lot of it fleshed out. So I'm looking forward to hopefully getting the writing drive back, because the pandemic has definitely, you know,
yeah,
dampened the creative spirit a little bit, I'll be honest. Oh my gosh.
So does that mean that you're more of a plotter than a pantser? You plan out all of what you're writing before you get started on it?
Yeah, absolutely. I outline a lot, and then inevitably, you know, the outlines end up changing a little bit once I actually get into a scene and realize, oh, the character who I had written to do this thing really would not say or do that in an organic way. Like, those are the kind of moments that you only figure out when you're trying to write through them. And that's one of the things that you know, I had heard writers talk about that, and you know, it wasn't until the Spidering and the Fascinators, because I had drafted things before those two published books, but it wasn't until those two books that I really saw what they meant about how it feels to try to get a character to do something, and to realize that they have their own agency, and there are certain things that they just will not do or say, no matter how solid your outline seemed. So I would say I'm definitely a plotter, but I give myself space to sort of change what I'd plan to do once I get into a scene and see what the characters want to do as well.
I think one of the members of our book club wants to come on screen and ask a question. So here's Susan. Hi, Susan.
Great. Hi, Susan.
Hi. Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you.
So I have a question. It's a little bit of a spoiler, but I'm going to be try to be as generic as I possibly can asking it. But it's about kind of magical structure and how magic works in your worlds, largely based on one of the spells, two of the spells cast. Well, one spell, and it's basically its cure, its reversal, but it involves transfer of magic from one person to another in both instances. And the way that magic seems to be set up, there are different types in the world. And based on the type of magic that you're using, your spell casting is slightly different. Now, magic gets transferred from one character to another character, and my big question is, the person who magic got transferred to the other character, does the second character who received the magic have like just a general boost to their own magic style based on how much magic they received, or do they now acquire that additional style of magic in conjunction with their own current magic? And then for the reversal of the spell, when magic is transferred again from one person to another, does the person get kind of like just a refill of their original magic, or do they have their original magic plus this new person's magic, or do they have just the new person's style of magic?
Yeah, I love this question. I love the detail that you're bringing to this, because you know what's so funny, and you know what is, you know, you've probably detected from some of the things I've said before this, that like there were things that are pretty different from what was originally the conceived version of it to the final version. And one of those things that was even more pronounced in the original version was the way that everyone sort of had a different specialty and a different type. So like there is still some holdover from that in the final book as you read it, that different magickers have different specialties of magic. But I definitely, by the final version, was imagining that works as that, you know, that person would be getting a general boost to their ability to do magic from taking a little bit of another person's ability to do magic. And I think, you know, I don't want to put too definitive an answer on it, because I think one of the defining things about what you see in the story is that there's disagreement from different people as far as how it's working, and the fact that, you know, the cult-like group, the dangerous group, sort of sells this concept of what they're planning to do to Delia by making it sound like it's something that will regenerate naturally. That, you know, if I siphon a little bit of magic from someone else, it's a little bit like having your blood drawn, you know, by a phlebotomist, and you'll be okay. You might have to drink some lemonade, but you'll be okay after a couple days. But then you know, realize from the way that it plays out that, you know, either they were underselling how dangerous it was actually going to be, or, you know, some of another character's actions, James's actions, got in the way of what they were trying to do. And I, you know, purposely don't answer that question on the page of like which one it actually is, but I did want to explore this idea that, you know, magic exists in a person in this mysterious way, a little bit like we think of a soul existing in a person in a mysterious way. And so It is this kind of unprecedented thing in the book when someone takes a little bit of someone else's ability to do magic. And we see with James that actually ends up like being way more harmful to him than the people who were trying to do it thought it would be. But I do see the people who did it as getting like a very general sort of boost across the board to all of their abilities. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, that does. And then that answers the first half, and then the second half, when someone else essentially donates blood / magic to a person, it's just kind of like boosting the system like blood does, where it's like just kind of gives it a jump start rather than. Okay.
That's exactly the metaphor that I had in mind. Yeah.
But one further question about this is, it kind of seems like a required number of people is necessary to perform this, but that number changes versus the beginning of the book and the end of the book. And I just wanted to know, is there actually a set number, or was that just kind of like something that they enforced based on like some kind of meaning to them as a group?
Yeah, I think the number is important to them, but I think the you know, there's this like axiom of magic that's said a couple times about like, you know, Merlin's law, like the more people involved in a spell, the more powerful it becomes. And my thinking on that was that I hope this makes sense, because in my head, the very technical explanation is that it's almost like a pull system, that like the more people you have involved, you know, in your simple machine trying to make a spell work, the easier it becomes to do something really complex. So to this particular group, you know, that's been getting some of the spells that they're getting, you know, through the two leaders kind of behind closed doors, they have in their head like a magic number, like this is our goal number, this is what we try to keep our group as, and if we lose a key member, we want to replace that member with another new member. So they have their like target number, but in my head, there are things that they could certainly try to do with fewer people, and, you know, whether they would go off as well or not is part of the question.
That works for me. Thank you so much. I really enjoyed your book.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate the question. Good to meet you.
Bye, Susan. But yeah, your discussion about it being similar to the soul being pulled reminded me a little of the cutters in The Golden Compass or his Dark Materials. Are there any books that you would say like most directly influenced, or movies or forms of media that most directly influenced the Fascinators?
That's a great question. I mean, I loved that trilogy in high school. Absolutely. I think like the mystery around magic too, and the way, you know, I love Diana Wynne Jones's books. I love the way that she writes about magic. And one of the things that I love about like the Crestomancy Chronicles and the way that she writes about magic is that you have the characters sort of, you know, young characters, kid characters, often like figuring their way through it kind of intuitively. And it never feels like she doesn't know the way that it really works. But the characters, because they don't have this really easy book to tell them how it works, or, you know, they don't always have an adult to just be able to walk them through everything they need to know. You know, they have these moments, you know, where they do this and does it work, and they do that and does it work. And it ends up being this really beautiful metaphor for, you know, childhood and young adulthood, and the way you kind of figure things out. And there's certain things that people can try to teach you, but really until you're doing them yourself, you can't know them. So that was it was a big part of, and that's one of the reasons why I love having this question from Susan. I love talking it out. But one of the things that made it tricky as I was writing was that there were times when I would write more of the world building answers onto the page and for me as a writer, as a creator, it would feel like I was like overwhelming the story with the things that I wasn't actually interested in showing the characters going through, because I wanted the characters to be up against a certain level of the unknown, and how that worked as like a metaphor for their story. So Diana Wynne Jones, very much a guiding light in that way. Other writers that I've read more recently that really, whose styles just like really just light, you know, my hair on fire, and I'm like, oh, if I could have anything look like that. Kelly Link is a writer whose short stories just like, I was working at Penguin when we first published her YA collection, Pretty Monsters, and remember reading an advanced copy of that and just being like, oh, I didn't know, you know, I didn't know a short story could do this. So I love the way she writes magic. I love Holly Black's books. You know, The Darkest Part of the Forest is a standalone with a really interesting sibling dynamic at the core, and she mixes magic in the real world in this way that when I read her books, I think like, that's, you know, this is what I'm trying to do. I would love to be able to do it as well as she does it, but you know, she's somebody who inspires me for sure. And then, you know, like thinking of the Spider Ring more so than the Fascinators, but even like I read his adult book, and John Bellairs is a writer who, like The House with a Clock in Its Walls, but then his adult book, The Face of the Frost, like he writes about magic and mixes it with mundane in this way that, you know, can feel really cozy, and I love that he does it in a way that's sometimes really funny too. That's something that I, you know, try to I don't know if I pull it off, but I try to do with my books, where I balance like moments of levity and banter with you know, the more serious cult-like conflicts that are happening, and John Bellairs is somebody who I think does that really well, and I love that about his books.
Yeah, John Bellairs and Diana Wynne Jones are like my childhood, so I appreciate mentioning both of them.
Yeah.
For our book club, Howl's Moving Castle was the first book that we started off with. But yeah, I think you definitely, like you talked about when you were first describing the book, how you have the like inner conflict and the like small things, as well as the like larger cult magic issues. Like you've got that balance between magic and mundane that makes things so interesting. I think there's another question in the comments from Isabella. It says, if you write a sequel, which would you prefer to focus on more, the aspect of Delia and the cult, or more on Denver and Sam, or even James?
I think it would be more. I think it would be Denver Sam. Like I imagine in my head like what Delia and James could be up to at the same time and how they could intersect. But for me, the heart of it, my heart is with following Denver and Sam. You mentioned Howl's Moving Castle. I don't know if your group or if anybody in the chat who loved Howl's Moving Castle, if you read The House of Many Ways, But, you know, a sequel many years later, after Howl's Moving Castle, and is one of my favorite novel sequels ever. But one of the things about it is, you know, Sophie and Howl were the main characters in Howl's Moving Castle. House of Many Ways, you start with this, you know, little girl, and you have no idea how she's connected to the events. And when she meets Sophie and Howl later and they become more involved in the story, it feels like just this wonderful surprise. Like, that's a little bit how, in the idea that I did have for a sequel, that's how it looked with Delia and James, and with some of the plot threads and conflicts from book 1, is that book 2 starts in a very focusing on a different place around Denver's story. Because I don't know, I don't know if anybody sort of wondered further about this or picked up on this, but you know, we hear a lot about James, Delia, and Sam's families, and we know, you know, their parents, siblings, you know, or in Sam's case, no siblings, but we don't hear as much about Denver and Amber's families. And there's a lot, I think, you know, especially in my head, that's going on with Denver's family that lays the ground for where I would go with another story.
That sounds really interesting. There's another question from Claire that says, as both an editor and an author, could you talk about your experience from both sides of the publishing world?
Sure. Yeah, they're very different jobs, weirdly, or maybe not weirdly. Maybe it's exactly what you'd guess. But so much of writing is having something really clear in your head and trying to get it onto the page. But then because it's so clear in your head, not always being the best gauge of how well a fresh reader who has no idea of what you're picturing can follow what you're suggesting or not. And so the editor is the person who comes in, you know, sometimes knowing from the author what's inspired them, sometimes knowing some of the backstory that led to this book being written. But really, you want to be reading it with fresh eyes. You want to be coming to the page fresh, so that you as the editor can tell the author, here are the places where you might be going for this, but you might also be going for that, and I'm not totally clear because here's what, you know, isn't clear on the page. And being able to, you know, like, part of being an editor is being able to know, oh, and you could be doing this, and if you are trying to do this, here's one way you could do that more clearly. But conversely, if you're trying to get at this, here's a way to. So it's like being able to offer options, being able to ask a lot of questions, but being that sort of like sympathetic reader who can go, you know, even if what I'm reading isn't in its full final version, I can see where you're trying to go, and, you know, I'm excited about it, and being encouraging in that way. And I love that as an editor, I get to sort of like be, honestly, like, I get to be like a patron of the arts in that way. I get to, you know, make offers often to debut writers who haven't been published before, or artists, because I work with a lot of graphic novelists as well. And there have been times when I've, you know, met an artist and just said, based on some panels of work, like, do you have an idea for a full graphic novel? So I love getting to do that cheerleading part. And I love getting to, you know, after I read something and fallen in love with it, just get to be the person who recommends it to everyone at my company, and, you know, like, tries to make things happen for it. And then that's very different from sort of like separate creative brain space that it takes to be that writer, where you kind of have to allow yourself to write a draft that might not be anywhere close to perfect the first time, because you're still figuring out how it should work. And that, if there's any tension between being an editor and being a writer, that's where it is, because it can be so hard to turn off the editor part of my brain and write a page without thinking like, oh, that sentence doesn't make any sense, and like, oh, that, you know, that paragraph isn't as strong as it could be, when you've got to write a lot of pages before you have any, you know, a full draft that you can edit and make stronger. So, you know, in some ways they overlap and inform each other, but it feels, in my experience, like in more ways they can be in tension. So it's trying to keep the spaces separate as much as possible.
Did you ever find yourself falling into like pitfalls that you've like helped people out of before, and be like, I know how to do this, why is it not working?
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. It's like so many, and I hope none of them ended up in the final book, but, you know, definitely, like, you can feel when a plot isn't working sometimes, I think. And before you can say why it isn't working, like you can feel, this doesn't feel like the right scene to come after that one, but I can't quite figure out why. And sometimes when you get to come to a story fresh as an editor, it can actually feel easier to make the leap to like, oh, well, this is why, you know, this is the connection that's missing from this scene to that scene. Whereas as the writer, you know, like, no, but it's not as easy as making that change because this character would never, you know, make the shift that you're suggesting. Because I know them really well in my brain, and it would never be as easy as just telling them to go left instead of right. And so that's where I do think it helps to be both, because I know as an editor, whenever I make a suggestion to an author that I know other editors and I all might wish were an easy change, you know, because it can seem so obvious when you're reading something fresh. As the author, you hear a suggestion or question like that and you think like, that's a huge change, going left instead of right. Like, what do you mean? So yeah, I definitely encountered those moments and thought like, why can't I make the character go left? It'd be so easy if I were just editing this.
Right. So Susan asks, did you always want to be an editor or a writer?
At some level I did, you know, I like interned for a newspaper when I was still in high school. I was definitely, you know, writing Redwall fan fiction when I was like in elementary school, and it was like on forums that thankfully don't exist anymore. But I was always like telling stories in some way, and you know, playing role-playing games where you would make up a story about a character. That was it always felt fun to me. And so, you know, it wasn't until I was in college and then interned as an editor that I actually thought it could be a possibility for it to be a career working in books. But I always knew that I enjoyed it, and I always, you know, wrote in my free time because I enjoyed it a lot. So, you know, now as a professional writer and editor, like I always have to remind myself of that sometimes, of like, okay, how do I need to realign either time commitments or the organization of my to-do list to make sure I'm like letting it stay fun, the writing and the editing. Because sometimes just the number of things you have to do for either one can make them feel as overwhelming as any other job. So you have to like do the work to make it feel fun again.
Emily asks, when you're writing a book, do you start with the story or with the characters?
That's a good question. I have done both. With the Fascinators, I had the story was a character like Sam realizing that he had this crush on a best friend character like James. They weren't named Sam and James right away. They didn't have all the details of their, you know, home and family lives that they do now. But that kind of like core dynamic was a big part of the story that I had in my head. At the same time, the idea of a world where, you know, magic existed, but for whatever reason, not everyone took it seriously, and so the people who did were kind of like outcasts, the way that Sam, James, and Delia are. That world building dynamic was also something I always wanted to tell in a story. And it took me a surprisingly long time before I saw the connection between this, you know, unrequited crush dynamic and this magic story and brought them together into one book. So in that sense, it's kind of like I have a running list of lots of ideas at any given time, and sometimes it's months after thinking of two that I realize, oh, those can belong together in one story. I don't know if you or anybody in the book club is like a Laini Taylor fan. As a YA fantasy writer, Children of Blood and Bone. I mean, Shadows, Daughter of Smoke and Bone. Sorry, the construction is like tripping me up. But she had written a blog post years ago about like when you're trying to come up with a new idea, the value of writing a list of just everything that interests you, like big and small. Like it can be, you know, I love Swan Lake, I love masquerade balls, like whatever it is, and sometimes like letting it sit and, you know, letting the connections come together, and and that feels true of my process a little bit. I have lots of different, here's a character, there's an idea, here's a premise, and sometimes they come together and make a book.
What would you say are the details that like you add in last at the end, typically?
I think with the Fascinators, like the getting the plot in the right to move in the right order, the right direction was the last thing, which feels like a kind of big, you know, a big thing to say I'm leaving for last. But really, like I said, because I have these journals and notebooks sometimes of world building information and character details and that sort of thing. Sometimes the struggle for me is that the actual story itself feels like it could be pulling in so many directions. And so that final step is narrowing it into, this is the scene that should come after this scene, and this is the scene that builds on that, and so on. And as an editor, one of my favorite like pieces of advice actually came from the show writers of South Park, of all places. But I heard them give a talk where they said, you know, when you're mapping out your story beats, the connection between any two scenes should always be and therefore, or but then. You should never have two scenes that are connected with and then, because if you do, then it means it's sort of like flatlined and there's no reason why this had to come after this. They both just kind of like happened. So you want to feel like this directly resulted in this, which directly resulted in the next thing. And that's something that it really does take me until I have that full draft written out and can look back at it and say, like, is every scene building on the one that came before it? Or are there places where I kind of like dropped the ball of the plot? And, you know, as one of my first readers of the book said, like, you know, just wrote a whole scene with people talking in a coffee shop because, you know, that's sometimes something that like can be fun to write and can be interesting for me to write, but you read it back in the page and realize like this is totally an and then scene because it just, you know, feels like a diversion. It just feels like a complete tangential thing.
Yeah. And your book wasn't purely chronological. Like it had like a flashback and it had like switches and points of view that could play with time. So like I can definitely see how like the positioning of different scenes could have been altered and have it.
Yes.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Totally.
So we've already talked about like your childhood books and things that influence this one, but what are some books that you would like want to give a shout out to, or things that you want to promote, or think that people should read now? Yeah,
so if you like the Fascinators, if you liked the sort of like cozy small town magic feel, one book I definitely recommend is Chris Barjak's Wonders of the Invisible World, which is, you know, a very similar small town magic feel, but in Ohio. And then Amy Rose Capetta's The Lost Coast is another one where it's, you know, West Coast, but small town magic feel with queer themes. I would definitely give a shout out to Adam Silvera as an author I work with, and his Infinity Cycle series, which began with Infinity Sun earlier this year, is another one where it's, you know, magic in the real world and with queer themes as well. And there's an upcoming book that I had the pleasure to like read early because I was on a panel with Aiden, the Cemetery Boys, which is, you know, Dia de los Muertos inspired fantasy mixing magic in the real world, and is great. I really enjoyed Ryan LaSala's Reverie earlier this year. I think it came out at the end of last year, actually, but it's another one where, again, sort of fantasy and reality mix with a gay protagonist. Yeah, I try to read as much, you know, what's like being published as I can in between like reading submissions and reading books by authors that I'm working with, but I'm always drawn to those. It feels like they end up mixing magic and real world in that way. So yeah, all of those I would recommend.
Yeah, that's a good list. We just read I think just before yours, Once and Future, co-written by Amy Rose Capetta.
Yeah.
So some good authors in there. Isabella has another question. She says, did you enjoy leaving the mystery of the bowling alley to the end? What was the idea behind waiting for the reveal?
That's a good question. I think part of waiting for the reveal, so what I realized pretty late in writing the Fascinators was that one of the big themes for me was the theme of like holding patterns. And for me, when I was growing up in Georgia, like I mentioned earlier, my holding pattern was that I thought my life was going to get started as soon as I went to college and got out of Newton. And in some ways that ended up, being a problem for me. And I wished, and part of what I wanted to do with the Fascinators was inspire people to, not have their eyes set on some future moment when everything will work out and be good, but rather to, open themselves up to the possibility that they can make their lives good where they are now. It was very late in the process that I realized that was something I was writing about with Sam, that, he is a character who maybe knows some of the answers that he doesn't want to acknowledge with his relationship with James. There is some legitimate mystery to James and James's feelings for Sam. But there's also an element, and a big important element, where Sam, might wish there were even more of a mystery than there is, because, with Sam and James meaning to be roommates the following year, Sam feels like if he just asked James point blank, what's going on between us? What are your feelings for me? If he got the answer that he didn't want, there's a lot at stake. And so what he's decided, and there's this joke in the beginning of the book where it's like his mom says his relationship with James is like Schrodinger's cat, and he just doesn't want to find out if there's actually something there or not, because he would rather have the mystery than have nothing at all. And for all of that reason, I really wanted some element to show that there was something that he just couldn't face about their relationship. And so that comes up in a few different ways. When he has a prophecy, when he uses the spell from the tabloid and kind of tries to tell the future about what's going to happen at Magic Convention, one of my favorite scenes to write in the book, the idea is that he can't look at the prediction head on. He's trying to catch it out of the corner of his eye. And that the idea of withholding what happened at the bowling alley was that I wanted to save that moment at the end to where he could finally look at with clear eyes, okay, here's what really happened. And what really happened is that this kid, well, maybe I shouldn't plot spoil, but kind of, I hope I can answer this question well enough, which is to say, it was very intentional to have something in the beginning that he couldn't face about the reality of what had happened. And that even while he was kind of talking around certain parts of it, I wanted to save something for that moment at the end when he finally was looking at everything laid bare and saying, okay, here's what the truth might be somewhere in here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes sense. So it was like a character development choice rather than based on plot. That makes a lot of sense. Yeah, one of the things that we discussed a lot during the book club meeting discussing this was the portrayal of Georgia and how authentic it felt. Because we've read a number of books set in Georgia in our book club, and this one really captured the feeling that a lot of us grew up with. So those small details, like the Hope Scholarship and deciding whether you're going to go to Steak and Shake or Waho, I think things like that really helped set it in Georgia. So we all just really appreciated that grounding and local feel.
Well, I appreciate hearing that. Thank you. It's good to hear.
Yeah, and going downtown to the Fox Theater and things like that. It's we've been there. It was a fun connection, even in a world different than our own.
Yeah.
What made you decide? You said it's set in a fictional town, right? What made you decide to make it a fictional place instead of a real place?
Yeah, I mean, it's a little bit the same with the friend of us, in VChat, where I didn't want it to be any one-to-one sort of You know, we talked about Friendivis and VChat, but there's also probably a more like salient social media site to mention, which is that there's like an analog for like the dark web sort of like Reddit kind of site where when Sam's like trying to do his digging into True Light, he goes on this site. And, you know, I think we've all seen on like sites like Reddit or 4chan, like some of these like seedier things, but I just really didn't want to invoke the like, I'm giving a pointed critique on this particular website. And it was, you know, it was similar in that, and the other reason is I actually, when I looked into the census data for Noonan now, it is much more of a suburb of Atlanta, much bigger, much more diverse. And you know, all of these are great. When I go back and visit my family now, it hardly, you know, resembles the Court Square area that I remember growing up around, where it really did feel like a small town. So it really has changed, and I wanted it to be a modern day story. And so, you know, the only way that I could get at, okay, here's how Noonan felt when I was growing up there, was to kind of move it closer to Milton, and, you know, locate an area where it felt like census data wise, it would still feel true of this area, but at the end of the day, you know, I wanted to make it a fictional town so that in 5 years it wouldn't be false again. But I had one really rewarding moment where I heard from a librarian who, without knowing me and without knowing that I had gone to Noonan High School, reached out to say, this felt so much like where I grew up, which was Noonan, Georgia. And it's like, great, good.
That's awesome. Well, it's coming up on the hour. So everybody, we want to remind you to support your local indie bookstores. And if that's us, we have copies of The Fascinators in stock. And Andrew is going to send us some signed book plates. So you should buy it. It's good. It's 10% off at the store, or you can order it through our website through the links that Kim has put in the comments. And tune back in for other author chats later. Thanks, everybody. Bye.
Thank you, Nicole, for having me. This was a lovely conversation, and thanks to the book club who read and asked such great questions today.
Thank you. It was a lot of fun.